After the intense clashes of the Pacific War, the fate of the F4F Wildcat became a story shaped not only by the evolution of aerial combat, but also by the transformation of American naval strategy. The aircraft that had once stood as the last defensive shield against the advancing Japanese forces during the early years of the war found itself transitioning into roles that few could have predicted at the start of the conflict. To understand what happened to the Wildcat after its decisive encounters with Japanese fighters, especially the A6M0, it is necessary to look at the period when it was gradually pushed out of frontline service, repurposed, and eventually woven into the broader legacy of American aviation. Even though the Wildcat was surpassed by faster and more advanced aircraft, its relevance did not simply vanish. Instead, it adapted to the changing environment of the war, continuing to serve in different capacities that contributed to the Allied victory. Once the United States Navy introduced newer aircraft like the F6F Hellcat and the F4U Corsair, the Wildcat's performance limitations became increasingly apparent. Its relatively low speed, limited climb rate, and outdated landing gear design were no longer suited to a battlefield dominated by high-performance fighters and large-scale carrier operations. The Wildcat had proven its resilience early in the war, with its rugged construction allowing it to withstand damage that would have easily destroyed more fragile aircraft. Yet, by 1943, the aircraft faced an inevitable shift in operational value. The Navy recognized the Wildcat's utility in environments where the newer aircraft could not operate as effectively, and this strategic reassignment became a key factor in shaping the aircraft's post-battle career. The escort carriers of the U.S. Navy played a pivotal role in giving the Wildcat an extended operational life. These smaller, slower carriers lacked the deck space needed to safely handle the larger Hellcats and Corsairs. For this reason, the Wildcat remained the fighter of choice aboard many escort carriers throughout the war. The pilots who continued to fly Wildcats in these units were often aware that they were not operating the Navy's most modern equipment, yet they also appreciated the aircraft's forgiving nature, its sturdy landing gear, and its ability to operate in harsh maritime conditions. In this environment, the Wildcat shifted from a frontline duelist to a versatile workhorse, one that escorted convoys, protected amphibious operations, and performed air patrols over vast expanses of ocean where the threat of Japanese submarines remained a constant concern. Its combat engagements after its famous battles against the Japanese shifted in tone and scale. Instead of intense dogfights against elite Japanese pilots, many Wildcat missions became focused on providing suppressive fire for landing operations, defending transport ships, and intercepting occasional reconnaissance aircraft. It also contributed significantly during the island-hopping campaign, supporting forces during operations in the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas. Although the Wildcat rarely faced the Zero in large-scale combat by this point, it still participated in skirmishes that demonstrated the continued value of a reliable platform. Pilots adapted their tactics to the aircraft's limitations, using altitude, teamwork, and the familiar thatch-weave maneuver to offset the agility of enemy planes when encounters did occur. As ground crews and pilots became more accustomed to the aircraft's quirks, the Wildcat developed a reputation as a dependable machine that simply refused to quit. Many pilots recalled stories of returning to carriers with severe structural damage, fuel leaks, or jammed gear, yet still managing to land because of the Wildcat's innate toughness. These stories contributed to the aircraft standing as a symbol of American resilience in the early Pacific War. Even as newer aircraft overshadowed it, the Wildcat remained deeply respected within naval aviation circles. This sentiment helped preserve interest in the aircraft long after it ceased flying combat missions. At the same time, the industrial production of the Wildcat transitioned from Grumman to General Motors, which manufactured the FM-1 and FM-2 variants. This shift allowed Grumman to focus on building the Hellcat, while GM continued producing Wildcats that were updated with improvements such as more powerful engines and increased ammunition capacity. These later models became the backbone of the escort carrier units. The FM-2 in particular, with its enhanced power-to-weight ratio, offered better takeoff performance and slightly improved combat capability. These adjustments helped keep the Wildcat relevant during the transitional period of the war, and many of these aircraft remained active until the war's end in 1945. As the war progressed, the demand for aircraft changed. When large-scale carrier battles became less frequent and Japan's air power diminished, the role of the Wildcat became increasingly logistical. It escorted convoys across dangerous waters, scouted for enemy submarines, and provided air support in smaller operations that did not justify deployment of the Navy's newest fighters. These assignments, while less glamorous than high-altitude duels, were essential to maintaining the momentum of the Allied advance. The aircraft's rugged frame made it suitable for harsh forward bases carved out from jungles or coral islands. In these remote outposts, spare parts were scarce, maintenance was difficult, and operating conditions were brutal. The Wildcat's simplicity became a significant advantage, allowing mechanics to keep the aircraft flying under conditions that would have grounded more advanced machines. By 1944, the Wildcat's role had clearly shifted from offensive spearhead to reliable support asset. Many pilots who transitioned to the Hellcat or Corsair looked back on their time in the Wildcat with a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude. They recognized that the aircraft had been a foundational element in American naval aviation, especially during the darkest days of the early Pacific War. Training programs continued to use Wildcats for carrier landing practice, and pilots appreciated its predictable handling characteristics. Although heavier and less agile than newer fighters, the Wildcat behaved consistently, making it ideal for developing carrier landing proficiency. This training role extended the aircraft's usefulness into the later stages of the war. As the conflict neared its end, the Wildcat began to disappear from frontline assignments. The expanding industrial capacity of the United States meant that the Navy could now deploy large numbers of advanced aircraft that rendered the Wildcat obsolete for most combat contexts. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the fate of many Wildcats followed a familiar pattern experienced by wartime aircraft around the world. Some were scrapped, others were parked in storage depots, and a few were sold as surplus to foreign air forces or civilian operators. The British Fleet Air Arm had also flown Wildcats under the name Martlet, and some of these aircraft continued flying for a short time after the war before being retired as newer designs became available. Those Wildcats that survived beyond immediate post-war scrapping were often repurposed for secondary roles. Some became civilian target tugs, used for training anti-aircraft gunners. Others entered private collections or were acquired by museums seeking to preserve the memory of wartime aviation. A handful of aircraft found new life in agricultural roles or as air racers, although the Wildcat's weight and design made it less ideal for such adaptations compared to other fighters of the era. Still, its ruggedness ensured that a number of Wildcats remained airworthy decades after the war, flying in airshows and commemorative events. These surviving aircraft became ambassadors for the legacy of the early Pacific battles, allowing new generations to see and hear the machine that had played such a vital role at a time when American forces were still struggling to gain momentum. The story of the Wildcat's post-combat life cannot be separated from the pilots who flew it. Many veterans described how their experiences in the Wildcat shaped their careers and their understanding of aerial warfare. They recalled the desperate early confrontations against the Zero, the isolation of long-range ocean patrols, and the tense moments spent circling above vulnerable troop transports. Even decades later, pilots spoke with emotion about the aircraft that had carried them through some of the most dangerous missions of their lives. Their stories helped cement the Wildcat's reputation as more than just an obsolete fighter. It was seen as a symbol of endurance and courage during the early chaos of the Pacific War. As aviation historians and enthusiasts began documenting the chronology of naval aircraft, the Wildcat's legacy gained renewed appreciation. Scholars pointed out that the aircraft's contributions extended far beyond the dogfights for which it was best known. They emphasized its essential role in escort carrier operations, its impact on training new generations of naval aviators, and its importance in holding the line during the war's early months. The Wildcat's design flaws and vulnerabilities were acknowledged, but so too were its strengths, durability, reliability, and an ability to function where more advanced aircraft could not. Without the Wildcat, the United States would have faced far greater challenges in maintaining control of the seas during the critical early stages of the Pacific Campaign. Today, the legacy of the Wildcat is visible in museums, aviation collections, and surviving airworthy aircraft around the world. These restorations not only preserve the physical form of the aircraft but also safeguard the stories of the pilots and crews who depended on it. Each restored Wildcat represents the resilience of an aircraft that continued to serve long after the battles that made it famous. Even though it was ultimately overshadowed by more advanced designs, the Wildcat's unique role ensured that it would never be forgotten. For many, the aircraft stands as a reminder of the determination required to confront overwhelming odds, and the innovation necessary to adapt old tools to new challenges. After the end of the war, the F4F Wildcat entered a new phase of existence that reflected both the rapid evolution of aviation technology and the changing strategic needs of the world's militaries. The aircraft that had once defended American carriers with unmatched determination now found itself in a landscape where jet propulsion, radar-guided weapons, and advanced aerodynamics redefined the very concept of air combat. Yet, instead of fading quietly into obscurity, the Wildcat carved out a unique place in the post-war world. Its ruggedness, simplicity, and proven track record made it valuable in unexpected ways, influencing training programs, civilian aviation, and even the cultural memory of the conflict. To understand what happened to the aircraft after the decisive battles against the Japanese, it is necessary to explore not only its military fate but also the long-lasting imprint it left on aviation history. When the war ended in 1945, the United States Navy found itself with a massive surplus of aircraft, including hundreds of Wildcats that were still airworthy. The immediate post-war years saw an aggressive demobilization effort, and many combat aircraft were scrapped simply because storing or maintaining them was too costly. The Wildcat, with its earlier design and piston-powered limitations, was quickly identified as outdated. Carrying it into the jet age would have been impractical. Still, not all aircraft met the scrapyard. Many Wildcats were placed in long-term storage, preserved in sealed hangars in case they were needed again. As Cold War tensions began to grow, the United States recognized the value of maintaining a reserve of reliable aircraft, even if they were no longer suitable for frontline combat against modern adversaries. This decision ensured that the Wildcat story would not abruptly end. Other Wildcats found their way into secondary roles. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps used some aircraft as utility planes in training environments, allowing new pilots to gain experience in basic flight procedures, formation flying, and gunnery practice. The aircraft's forgiving handling characteristics made it suitable for novice pilots, and instructors appreciated its durability, which reduced the risk of catastrophic accidents during training. Even though it could no longer compete with modern fighters, the Wildcat still offered an authentic experience of wartime aviation, giving trainees a valuable sense of the challenges faced by pilots in earlier combat operations. These training assignments extended the life of many Wildcats well into the late 1940s. The British Fleet Air Arm had flown a version of the Wildcat known as the Martlet during the war. After the conflict, the British also faced major demobilization, and most Martlets were quickly retired. However, several were sold or transferred to other Allied nations whose air forces were rebuilding on limited budgets. Countries in South America, Europe, and the Caribbean briefly operated Wildcats in small numbers, primarily for patrol duties or pilot training. These post-war exports demonstrated the aircraft's continued reliability even after years of heavy combat use. Although these foreign-operated Wildcats did not remain in service for long, they offered a transitional air fleet for nations that lacked immediate access to modern designs. Meanwhile, the private sector saw potential in military surplus Wildcats for use in civilian tasks. A handful of aircraft were purchased by private owners for experimental purposes or display flying. Some were converted into target tugs, towing fabric sleeves behind them so ground-based anti-aircraft units could practice their aim. This role, although less glamorous than wartime combat, required stable and durable aircraft capable of handling long flights under repetitive stress. The Wildcat, as always, proved adequate for the job. Because it was built to withstand battle damage, pulling a target through the sky was well within its capabilities. However, as decades passed and the aircraft aged, Wildcat numbers dwindled. Many were scrapped for parts, and others deteriorated in open storage fields exposed to the elements. It was during this period that aviation enthusiasts, veterans, and historians began to take a renewed interest in the aircraft. They recognized that the Wildcat represented a crucial chapter in the story of naval aviation, a symbol of resilience during a time when American forces struggled to counter the Japanese advance across the Pacific. The aircraft's rugged silhouette and distinctive engine sound became emblematic of the early war years, and this growing appreciation fueled restoration efforts. By the 1960s and 1970s, warbird restoration had become a dedicated hobby among aviation enthusiasts. Individuals, museums, and organizations began seeking out derelict Wildcats to restore them to flying condition. The process was arduous. Many surviving frames were heavily damaged, cannibalized for parts, or incomplete. Restorers had to search for original components, reverse engineer missing pieces, and study technical manuals that had not been used for decades. Yet the passion to preserve the Wildcat drove these efforts forward. Slowly, aircraft that had once patrolled the skies of the Pacific returned to life in workshops and hangars around the world. One of the reasons the Wildcat attracted so much restoration attention was its historical importance as the aircraft that bridged the gap between pre-war aviation and modern carrier warfare. During the early stages of World War II, the Wildcat had been the only American fighter capable of standing up to the Japanese Zero, and even though it was technically inferior, the tactics developed around the Wildcat became foundational elements of naval air combat doctrine. The famous thatch weave, designed specifically to compensate for the Wildcat's disadvantages, became one of the most influential tactical developments in fighter aviation. Restoring Wildcats allowed historians and engineers to study firsthand the aircraft that shaped these tactics. As restored Wildcats began appearing in airshows, they attracted large audiences who were eager to see and hear the machines that had defended American carriers during some of the war's most critical moments. The sound of the Wildcat's radial engine, the distinctive shape of its folding wings, and its stocky profile evoked strong emotions, especially among veterans who remembered the aircraft from their youth. For many former pilots and mechanics, the opportunity to interact with a Wildcat again, to touch its metal skin, peer into its cockpit, or hear its engine roar, was profoundly meaningful. These events ensured that the legacy of the Wildcat remained alive not only in museums but also in the memories of the people who experienced its operation firsthand. Meanwhile, historians continued to re-evaluate the Wildcat's role in the war, providing deeper insight into its tactical evolution. Although later aircraft such as the Hellcat, Corsair, and Mustang often overshadowed it in popular culture, scholars argued that the Wildcat had played an irreplaceable role in preventing early Japanese dominance from becoming absolute. Without the Wildcat's contribution during the Battle of Midway, the Guadalcanal Campaign, and other early engagements, the strategic situation in the Pacific could have unfolded very differently. These analyses helped elevate the aircraft from a simple early war relic to a symbol of the resilience and adaptability of American aviation forces. The surviving Wildcats also served educational purposes. Museums used them as teaching tools to explain the evolution of naval aviation and the challenges of carrier-based flight. Visitors could observe how the aircraft's landing gear retracted into the fuselage, how its wings folded for deck storage, and how its cockpit instruments reflected the manual, analog nature of early 20th century aviation. These displays helped younger generations understand the complexity of wartime aviation and the skill required to operate such machinery in combat conditions. The Wildcat became not just an artifact of war but also a window into the past, allowing people to connect with history in a tangible and visceral way. As the decades passed, the Wildcat even entered the realm of popular culture. It appeared in films, documentaries, and video games that depicted the Pacific War. Its distinctive design made it instantly recognizable, and its role in dramatic early battles captured the imagination of audiences around the world. This cultural presence helped ensure that the aircraft remained a familiar symbol of the era, even for those who were not deeply versed in aviation history. For enthusiasts and gamers, flying a virtual Wildcat became a way of experiencing the challenges faced by its real-life pilots, including the strategic decisions and split-second reactions required to survive aerial combat. In the modern era, the remaining Wildcats are cherished as rare and historically valuable aircraft. Only a small number remain airworthy, and these are maintained with extraordinary care. Owners meticulously document their restoration processes, ensuring that every detail, from paint schemes to cockpit instruments, matches the aircraft's original wartime configuration. When these aircraft take to the skies, They serve as living memorials to the pilots who flew them and the crews who maintained them under the harshest conditions imaginable. Their flights offer a reminder of the ingenuity required to defend a nation during a time of global crisis. The aircraft that once struggled to keep pace with the Zero ultimately found its legacy not in technological superiority but in its contribution to overcoming adversity. Pilots who flew the Wildcat often emphasized that it was not a machine designed for easy victory. It required skill, discipline, and teamwork. Its limitations forced American aviators to innovate, developing tactics and training methods that shaped the future of naval aviation. In this way, the Wildcat's influence extended far beyond its immediate post-war fate. Even though it did not participate in the jet age or the Cold War's advanced aerial conflicts, it shaped the pilots and doctrines that carried American aviation into the future. Today, the Wildcat story is a reminder of the complex journey that wartime aircraft undergo once their battles are over. Some become scrap metal, others become museum pieces, and a fortunate few become flying monuments to the courage and sacrifice of an earlier generation. The F4F Wildcat belonged to all of these categories at different points in its post-war history. Its durability allowed many examples to survive long enough to be rediscovered by historians and enthusiasts. Its historical significance ensured that it would be preserved in museums and airshows. And its cultural legacy guaranteed that it would never be forgotten, even as newer technologies replaced it in the world's skies. Ultimately, what happened to the F4F Wildcat after its fierce battles against the Japanese is a reflection of the broader evolution of military aviation. The aircraft transitioned from a frontline fighter to a support asset, from a training tool to a surplus commodity, and finally from an artifact of war to a treasured piece of history. Each phase of this transition contributed to the preservation of its legacy. The Wildcat story did not end when it left combat service. It continued through the hands of the people who restored it, studied it, and honored it. The aircraft that once weathered enemy fire and protected vulnerable fleets continues to inspire admiration for its resilience and for the men who flew it during one of the most challenging chapters of naval aviation history.